December 7th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich crouched behind a snow-covered log, watching through field glasses as American vehicles rolled into the valley below. The convoy stretched for nearly half a kilometer, trucks and armoured vehicles moving cautiously along the narrow forest road. Among them, several half-tracks caught his attention, their angular shapes looking fragile against the winter landscape. Dietrich lowered his binoculasses and turned to his squad leader, Feldwebel Ernst Vogel, who was studying a map beneath the sparse cover of pine branches. "The American machines," Klaus said quietly, gesturing toward the valley. "They look like they're made of sheet metal, tin boxes on tracks." Vogel glanced up briefly, his weathered face showing neither surprise nor concern. He had fought in Poland, France, and 2 brutal winters on the Eastern Front. The scars on his left hand, half-healed burns from a 34 engagement near Kursk, were a testament to what real armour looked like. "That's because they are," he replied, folding the map. "American half-tracks. We've seen them before. The sides are barely thicker than your helmet. Rifle-caliber rounds can punch through at close range." The younger soldier, Gefreiter Otto Baumann, shifted nervously beside them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His hands were wrapped in wool rags, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Then why do they even use them?" he asked. "Seems like suicide to put men in those things." Vogel smiled grimly. "Because Americans have so many they can afford to waste them. They use them like we use motorcycles or trucks. Transport, nothing more." He pulled out a cigarette, cupping his hand around the match as he lit it. "Their armour won't stop a Panzerfaust, won't stop a 20mm, won't even stop sustained machine gun fire from our MG-42s. Dietrich watched the convoy continue its slow progress. The half-tracks moved in a staggered pattern, one every few 100 meters, interspersed with supply trucks and the occasional Sherman tank. On the turret roof of each half-track, he could see the distinctive profile of a heavy machine gun, the long barrel tracking slowly from side to side as the gunners scanned the tree line. "What about those guns they're carrying?" Dietrich asked. Vogel exhaled smoke through his nose. "The 50 caliber Browning. Dangerous weapon. Yes, but only against infantry and aircraft." He tapped ash onto the snow. "It's a machine gun, Klaus. A big one, but still just a machine gun. It won't penetrate our armour." The confidence in Vogel's voice was absolute. It was the kind of certainty that came from experience, from watching German armour crush opposition across half of Europe. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on superior engineering, on tanks with thick, sloped armour that could shrug off most Allied weapons. The Panzer IV, the Panther, the Tiger. These were machines that commanded respect. The idea that an American machine gun, no matter how large, could threaten German armour seemed almost laughable. But what Vogel and his men did not know, what German intelligence had not yet fully grasped, was that by late 1944, American doctrine had evolved in ways that German planners had not anticipated. The 50 caliber Browning M2 had been mounted on virtually every American combat vehicle, and American crews had learned through months of combat exactly where and how to employ it most effectively. Otto interrupted the silence. "When do we engage them?" Vogel checked his watch. "Not yet. We wait for the Panzers. The 2nd Panzer Division has 2 companies moving up from the south. They'll hit the Americans at the crossroads near Rocherath. We're just here to observe and report." Dietrich kept his binoculars trained on the convoy. As he watched, one of the half-tracks slowed, its commander standing in the turret, scanning the hills with his own field glasses. For a moment, Dietrich had the unsettling feeling that the American was looking directly at him, though he knew that was impossible at this distance through the dense forest. The American half-track, officially designated the M3 and M2 depending on the variant, had entered service in 1941. It was built on a simple chassis, combining a conventional truck-style front with tracked propulsion at the rear. The armour consisted of rolled homogeneous steel plates, ranging from a 1/4 inch on the floor to 5/8 of an inch on the front glacis. The sides were even thinner, just over a 1/4 inch, enough to stop small arms fire and shrapnel, but little else. German intelligence reports from 1943 had correctly assessed the half-track's vulnerability. Captured American training manuals confirmed that crews were instructed to treat the vehicles as battle taxis, not assault guns. The armor was meant to protect against indirect fire and light weapons during transport, nothing more. In theory, this made perfect sense. In practice, the Americans had turned the half-track into something the Germans had not expected, a mobile weapons platform that could deliver devastating volumes of accurate fire while remaining surprisingly difficult to destroy. The reason was simple. The half-tracks were fast, maneuverable, and equipped with the Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun. This weapon, firing a 1/2-inch diameter projectile at nearly 3,000 feet per second, possessed a muzzle energy of over 13,000 foot-pounds. While German assessments correctly noted that the 50 caliber could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV, they had not fully accounted for 3 critical factors: the vulnerability of side and rear armor at close range, the weapon's effectiveness against vision ports, hatches, and mechanical systems, and the sheer volume of fire that American crews were willing and able to sustain. By December of 1944, American armored divisions had integrated half-tracks into every phase of combined arms operations. They weren't just transports anymore. They were reconnaissance vehicles, fire support platforms, anti-aircraft batteries, and convoy escorts. And the men who crewed them had learned hard lessons in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Hurtgen about how to keep their thin-skinned vehicles alive on a battlefield dominated by German armor. Vogel crushed his cigarette in the snow and pulled out his map again. "The American convoy is heading toward the crossroads," he said. "If they continue at this pace, they'll be there in 90 minutes. That's where we'll stop them." He looked at his squad, 5 men armed with Kar 98 rifles, 1 MG-42 machine gun, and 2 Panzerfausts. Along with the Panzers, of course. This will be over quickly. Dietrich nodded, but a knot of unease had formed in his stomach. He had learned on the Eastern Front that confidence could kill as surely as a bullet. The Russians had taught him that lesson in blood. Underestimating the enemy, dismissing their equipment as inferior, these were the mistakes that left good soldiers dead in the snow. He watched the American convoy disappear around a bend in the road, the sound of engines fading into the distance. Somewhere ahead, German armor was moving into position. Somewhere ahead, men on both sides were preparing to kill each other over a few kilometers of frozen forest. And somewhere in that equation, the thin-skinned American half-tracks and their oversized machine guns were about to demonstrate a truth that German tactical doctrine had not yet fully acknowledged. The difference between theory and reality in war is often written in casualties. 3 hours later, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Ice crystals formed on the inside of Dietrich's collar, and his fingers had gone numb inside his gloves, despite the wool lining. The German squad had moved to a position overlooking the crossroads where 2 narrow forest tracks intersected. From here, they had clear fields of observation in 3 directions. Behind them, hidden in a dense stand of pine trees, 2 Panzer IVs waited, their engines cold, crews standing by. The American convoy had halted at the crossroads. Dietrich counted 12 vehicles, 6 supply trucks, 4 half-tracks, and 2 Sherman tanks positioned at the front and rear of the column. The Americans were being cautious, sending out dismounted infantry to scout the tree lines while their vehicles remained in the road. Smoke rose from small fires as soldiers attempted to warm themselves in the brutal cold. Hauptmann Weber, the company commander, crouched beside Vogel with a set of maps spread across a flat rock. The captain was younger than most of his men, barely 30, but he carried himself with the rigid formality that came from Prussian military academies. He tapped the map with a gloved finger. "We hit them here," Weber said quietly. "The Panzers will engage from the south, targeting the Sherman tanks first. Once the Americans are focused on that threat, we sweep in from the north with infantry and cut off their retreat. The half-tracks won't survive the crossfire. Vogel nodded. What about their air support? Weber glanced at the overcast sky. Weather is in our favor. Low clouds, snow coming in from the west. Their fighter bombers won't be able to operate. This is our window. From his vantage point, Dietrich watched the American soldiers moving around their vehicles. They looked cold, tired, and exposed. One half-track crew had dismounted their 50 caliber machine gun and were performing maintenance on it, cleaning the barrel with a long rod, while another soldier fed a fresh ammunition belt into the receiver. The weapon gleamed dully in the grey afternoon light, its massive size making it look almost comical mounted on the relatively small half-track. Otto nudged Dietrich and whispered, "Look at the size of that gun. Must weigh more than the vehicle itself." "It nearly does," Dietrich replied. He had read the intelligence briefs. The M2 Browning weighed 84 pounds without its mount, and with the tripod or vehicle mounting system, the complete assembly approached 130 pounds. The half-track itself, stripped down, weighed just under 8,000 pounds. The 50 caliber and its ammunition represented a significant portion of the vehicle's combat load. But what impressed Dietrich was not the weight of the gun, but the care the Americans took with it. Even in freezing conditions, even while exposed to potential enemy fire, the crew meticulously maintained their weapon. That kind of discipline suggested experience. It suggested that these men knew their survival depended on that machine gun functioning perfectly when called upon. Weber checked his watch. 15 minutes. He turned to the radio operator and spoke quietly into the handset. "All units, prepare to engage on my signal. Panzers, you are cleared to move into firing positions." In the distance, Dietrich heard the faint rumble of engines as the German tanks began their approach. The sound was deep and guttural, the unmistakable growl of Maybach engines powering 30-ton machines through the forest. The Panzer IV OSF H models that 2nd Panzer Division operated carried 75mm guns and frontal armour up to 80mm thick. Against the thin-skinned American half-tracks and supply trucks, they would be devastating. The plan was sound. The Americans were exposed, stationary, and vulnerable. The weather prevented air support. The German armour had superior firepower and protection. This should have been a textbook engagement, a quick, violent strike that would leave the American convoy destroyed and the crossroads firmly in German hands. But war has a way of punishing assumptions. The 1st Panzer IV emerged from the tree line, 400 meters south of the crossroads. Its commander, Lieutenant Schröder, had positioned his tank on a slight rise that gave him clear lines of fire to the American vehicles below. The 2nd Panzer moved into position 50 meters to his left, turrets traversing smoothly as gunners acquired targets. Schröder's voice crackled over the radio net. Target identified. Lead Sherman, range 400 meters, preparing to fire. In the American convoy, someone spotted the movement. A shout went up, piercing and urgent, the universal sound of contact. Soldiers scrambled for cover, diving behind vehicles or sprinting for the tree line. The Sherman tanks lurched into motion, their drivers gunning engines as commanders screamed orders. Then Schröder's Panzer fired. The 75mm gun roared, the crack echoing through the forest. The armour-piercing round crossed the distance in less than a second, striking the lead Sherman on its frontal slope. The impact created shower of sparks and the distinctive ring of steel on steel. The German shell, fired at an oblique angle, deflected upward, failing to penetrate the Sherman's glacis plate. Schröder cursed and ordered his gunner to reload. Target the tracks, immobilize it. But the Americans were already responding. The Sherman's turret swung toward the German position with surprising speed. Its commander had seen the muzzle flash and calculated the enemy's location instantly. The 75mm gun on the Sherman barked twice in rapid succession. The first round fell short, exploding in the snow 20 meters in front of Schröder's Panzer. The second hit the glacis plate but failed to penetrate, the shell shattering against the thick German armour. For a moment, it seemed the engagement would follow the expected pattern. Tanks duelling at medium range, armour against armour, a test of gunnery skill and crew coordination. But then the American half-tracks entered the fight, and the nature of the battle changed completely. The nearest M3 half-track was positioned 30 meters behind the lead Sherman. Its commander, a sergeant named Tom Morrison from Pennsylvania, had served in North Africa and Sicily before arriving in Europe. He knew that his vehicle's armor was worthless against tank fire. He also knew that his 50 caliber Browning M2 could do things that most people, including the Germans, did not expect. Morrison stood in the turret ring, his gunner beside him already swinging the heavy machine gun toward the German tanks. The weapon's barrel extended almost 6 feet beyond the half-track's sides, its distinctive perforated sleeve instantly recognizable. Morrison grabbed the spade grips and pressed the butterfly trigger. The M2 erupted with a sound like continuous thunder. The recoil rocked the half-track on its suspension, but the mounting system absorbed most of the shock. Tracer rounds, glowing red, arced across the 400 meters separating the Americans from the German armor. Morrison walked his fire onto the lead Panzer, aiming not for the thick frontal armor, but for the vulnerable points he had learned to recognize through months of combat. The first burst struck the Panzer's turret, rounds ricocheting off the heavy armor in bright sparks. But Morrison adjusted, lowering his aim to the junction between turret and hull, where vision ports and periscopes provided the crew with situational awareness. 50 caliber rounds slammed into these openings, shattering glass and warping metal. One round penetrated a periscope housing, the half-inch projectile punching through the relatively thin armor that surrounded the optical equipment. Inside Schroeder's Panzer, the impact was catastrophic. The penetrating round fragmented, sending shrapnel through the fighting compartment. The gunner screamed, clutching his face as blood streamed between his fingers. The loader fell backward, struck by a secondary fragment that tore through his shoulder. Schroeder himself was knocked sideways by the concussion, his helmet ringing like a bell. "Return fire!" he shouted, but his gunner was blind and bleeding, incapable of aiming the main gun. The loader tried to move, to help, but his wounded shoulder made it impossible to lift the heavy 75mm shells. The second half-track joined the fight. This one, commanded by Corporal Jimmy Chen from San Francisco, carried an M2 with an extended ammunition supply. Chen had rigged extra ammunition cans on both sides of his vehicle, giving him nearly 1,500 rounds of ready ammunition. He opened fire on the second Panzer, concentrating his fire on the vehicle's engine deck. The Panzer IV's rear armor was significantly thinner than its frontal protection, only 20mm in most places. This was generally sufficient to defeat rifle fire and even light cannon rounds at range. But the 50 caliber Browning fired projectiles with tremendous penetrative power at close to medium ranges. Chen's sustained burst, over 100 rounds in 10 seconds, began to have an effect. Several rounds struck the engine deck's ventilation louvers, punching through the thin slats and ricocheting into the engine compartment. One round severed a fuel line. Another struck the radiator, releasing a cloud of steam and coolant. The Panzer's engine began to sputter, losing power as coolant temperature spiked and fuel pressure dropped. The German tank commander, Feldwebel Klaus Dietrich, felt his vehicle shudder. The engine note changed, becoming rough and irregular. Smoke began seeping into the crew compartment, acrid and choking. "Engine damage!" his driver shouted. "We're losing power!" Newman faced an impossible choice. He could remain in position and try to continue engaging with his main gun, but his vehicle was crippled and under sustained fire. Or he could attempt to withdraw, accepting temporary retreat to save his tank and crew. He chose survival. "Pull. Back," he ordered. "Full reverse. Get us into the tree line." But reversing a damaged Panzer IV while under fire was not a simple matter. The tank lurched backward, its wounded engine barely providing enough power to move the 30-ton vehicle. As it retreated, it exposed its thinner side armor to the American guns. Morrison saw the opportunity immediately. He shifted fire from the first Panzer to the second, now presenting its flank. The Panzer IV's side armor was 30mm thick, substantially more than the rear deck, but still vulnerable to the right ammunition at the right angle. The M2 Browning could fire several different types of 50 caliber ammunition. The most common was the M33 ball round, a solid projectile that relied on kinetic energy for penetration. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But American crews also carried armor-piercing incendiary rounds, designated M8 API and M20 APIT. These rounds featured hardened steel cores and incendiary charges designed to ignite fuel or ammunition upon penetration. Morrison's ammunition belt was mixed, one tracer followed by one armor-piercing incendiary, then 3 ball rounds, a pattern that repeated every 5 rounds. As he fired at the retreating Panzer's side, several of the armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the vehicle's side skirts. Thin plates of armor hung on the outside of the hull to protect against shaped charge weapons. The side skirts shattered under the repeated impacts. 50 caliber rounds punched through the relatively thin steel and continued into the main hull. At this oblique angle and close range, approximately 200 meters, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds began penetrating the Panzer's 30mm side armor. Not every round penetrated, perhaps 1 in 10, but Morrison was firing at a rate of 550 rounds per minute. Inside Neumann's Panzer, penetrations began to occur. 1 round punched through the side armor and struck a stored ammunition case, but the thick steel casing of the 75mm shell prevented detonation. Another round penetrated and ricocheted wildly inside the crew compartment, the half-inch projectile tumbling and fragmenting as it lost energy. The driver screamed as a fragment tore into his leg. "We're being penetrated," Neumann shouted into his radio. 50 caliber fire is coming through the sides. Hauptmann Weber, we need support. But Weber, watching from his position in the tree line, was struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. American half-tracks, vehicles he had been taught to regard as transport carriers with minimal combat value, were engaging German tanks and forcing them to withdraw. It contradicted everything his training and experience had taught him. Otto, crouched beside Dietrich, whispered in disbelief, "They're shooting through the armor. How is that possible?" Dietrich's mouth was dry. He had read the intelligence reports about American firepower, but reading about it and watching it happen were entirely different experiences. "Those aren't just machine guns," he said quietly. "They're anti-material weapons, big enough to damage engines, optics, tracks, and at close range, apparently big enough to penetrate side armor." The engagement was devolving into chaos. Schroeder's Panzer, its crew wounded and its optics destroyed, attempted to reverse away from the American position. But with the commander partially incapacitated and the gunner blinded, the driver had no guidance. The tank backed directly into a large tree, the impact jarring the entire crew. The engine stalled, and suddenly the 30-ton machine was immobilized, sitting broadside to the American guns with its most vulnerable aspects exposed. The third American half-track, this one carrying a squad of infantry in addition to its 50 caliber, moved forward aggressively. Its commander recognized that the German tanks were in disarray and that momentum belonged to the Americans. The half-track advanced at nearly 30 miles per hour, its tracks churning through snow as it closed the distance. At 100 meters, the 50 caliber gunner opened fire on Schroeder's immobilized Panzer. At this range, the kinetic energy of the 50 caliber rounds was tremendous. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the tank's side, and several penetrated cleanly. 1 round entered the crew compartment through a weakened section of armor near a weld joint, already stressed by previous impacts. The penetrating round struck a rack of stored machine gun ammunition, 7.92mm rounds for the Panzer's hull-mounted MG-34. The secondary explosion was not large, but it was enough to ignite stored materials and create dense smoke inside the tank. "Bail out!" Schroeder screamed, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Abandon the vehicle." The German crew scrambled for the hatches. The driver, wounded but mobile, pushed his hatch open and hauled himself out, rolling off the glacis plate into tow, the snow. The radio operator followed, dragging the blinded gunner. Schroeder emerged last, pulling the wounded loader with him. They tumbled into the snow and crawled frantically toward the tree line as 50 caliber rounds snapped overhead. The second Panzer, Neumann's vehicle, had managed to retreat into the forest, trailing smoke and leaking fluids. Its engine was failing, and the driver reported that steering was becoming increasingly difficult. Neumann knew his tank was finished for this engagement, possibly permanently. He ordered his crew to dismount and establish a defensive position in the trees. In less than 5 minutes, the German armour advantage had evaporated. Both panzers were out of action, one abandoned and burning, the other crippled and withdrawn. The Americans still held the crossroads, and now their infantry were fanning out, pushing toward the German observation positions. Hauptmann Weber stared at the scene in stunned silence. His carefully planned ambush had collapsed. The American half-tracks had not behaved as the intelligence reports predicted. Instead of fleeing or being quickly destroyed, they had stood and fought, using their heavy machine guns with devastating effectiveness against targets they were not supposed to be able to engage. Vogel grabbed Weber's arm. "Sir, we need to pull back. If those half-tracks reach our position, we don't have weapons that can stop them at close range." Weber wanted to argue, wanted to order his infantry forward, to salvage something from this disaster. But he was a competent enough officer to recognize a lost position when he saw one. "Fall back," he ordered quietly. "Withdraw to the secondary position. We'll regroup and report." The German squad began pulling back through the forest, moving quickly and quietly. Dietrich cast one last look at the crossroads, where the American half-tracks were repositioning, their 50 caliber machine guns scanning for new targets. The vehicles looked just as flimsy. As before, their thin armour obviously inadequate for direct combat, but their guns were another matter entirely. As the Germans retreated through the snow, Otto stumbled beside Dietrich, breathing hard. "I don't understand," he gasped. "How did they do that? How did machine guns destroy tanks?" Dietrich helped him keep pace, pulling him along. "Because we were wrong," he said bitterly. "We thought armour thickness was everything. We forgot that tanks have vulnerable points: optics, hatches, engine decks, cooling systems. The Americans found those points and hit them with enough firepower to cause failures. But the intelligence reports said—" "The intelligence reports were incomplete," Dietrich interrupted. "They told us what the American half-tracks couldn't do. They didn't tell us what the Americans would do anyway." Behind them, the sound of 50 caliber fire continued to echo through the forest, a deep, rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the air itself. It was a sound the Germans were learning to fear, not because it represented invincibility, but because it represented something perhaps more dangerous: American willingness to adapt, to innovate, to use what they had in ways the enemy did not expect. The Germans had laughed at the cardboard armour of American half-tracks. They had dismissed the 50 caliber as merely a large machine gun, ineffective against real armour. By the end of that December day, 12 kilometers from a crossroads that would never appear in official histories, those assumptions lay shattered in the snow alongside burning German tanks. The lesson would be repeated across the Ardennes in the weeks that followed, a painful education written in destroyed vehicles and wounded pride. The Americans had not built better tanks. They had built a system: reliable weapons, abundant ammunition, aggressive doctrine, and crews trained to exploit every advantage, no matter how unconventional. That evening, in a farmhouse converted to a temporary field, headquarters, Weber filed his after-action report. His hands shook slightly as he wrote, not from fear, but from the lingering shock of what he had witnessed. He described the engagement in detail, carefully noting the effectiveness of American 50 caliber fire against German armour. The report would climb the chain of command, eventually reaching division headquarters, then corps, then army group. Staff officers would read it with skepticism, then concern, then quiet alarm, as similar reports began arriving from other sectors. The Americans were not playing by the expected rules. Their thin-skinned vehicles were operating far more aggressively than doctrine suggested they should, and their heavy machine guns were being employed as anti-armour weapons with disturbing effectiveness. But changing institutional doctrine takes time, and in December of 1944, time was something the German army no longer had. The Ardennes offensive was already beginning to stall. American resistance was stiffening, and those despised cardboard half-tracks were proving to be far more dangerous than anyone had predicted. In the weeks that followed the engagement at the crossroads, American half-tracks continued to confound German expectations across the Ardennes front. The pattern repeated itself in dozens of small engagements. German forces would encounter American convoys or positions, assume the half-tracks were vulnerable, and discover too late that the 50 caliber Brownings mounted on these vehicles could inflict serious damage on German armor when employed by experienced crews. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. Veterans who had learned to respect Soviet armor and British tactical skill now had to add American firepower to the list of threats that could not be underestimated. Young replacements, already demoralized by Germany's deteriorating strategic position, found their confidence further eroded by stories of indestructible American machine guns that could destroy tanks. Dietrich's squad, having survived the crossroads engagement, was pulled back to a rear area for rest and refit. On the third night, sitting in a damaged barn that served as their temporary quarters, the men discussed what they had seen. Vogel, his face drawn and tired, addressed the group. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said quietly. "We made assumptions based on incomplete information. We judged American equipment by its appearance, not its capability." Otto, his frost-damaged hands wrapped in bandages, nodded. "The half-tracks look weak. The armor is thin. But the gun changes everything." "It's not just the gun," Dietrich interjected. "It's how they use it. The Americans don't fight the way we do. They don't rely on individual skill or superior equipment. They rely on systems. Lots of weapons, lots of ammunition, lots of coordination. Every vehicle has a heavy machine gun. Every crew knows how to use it. They don't need to be elite troops. They just need to follow their doctrine and overwhelm us with firepower." A replacement, a young Gefreiter named Hans, who had arrived from training just days before, spoke up nervously. "Can we stop them? I mean, is there a way to defeat their tactics?" Vogel considered the question. "Yes," he said finally. "We can still win individual engagements, but we need to change our approach. No more assuming enemy equipment is inferior, no more frontal assaults against prepared positions. We need to use our mobility, our training, and our knowledge of the terrain to create advantages they can't overcome with firepower alone." But even as Vogel spoke, he knew the truth. The German army in late 1944 lacked the resources to implement sophisticated tactical solutions consistently. Fuel shortages, limited mobility. Personnel losses meant many units were filled with poorly trained replacements. Air superiority belonged to the Allies, making daytime maneuver nearly suicidal. The Americans could afford to fight a firepower-intensive war of attrition. Germany could not. In the American camp, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Morrison's half-track crew had received commendation for their actions at the crossroads. The official citation noted that their effective use of heavy machine gun fire had neutralized enemy armor and prevented the destruction of the convoy. Morrison read the citation to his crew with dry humor. "It says we neutralized enemy armor," he announced. "That's a fancy way of saying we shot the hell out of 2 Panzers until they gave up and ran away." His gunner, a corporal named Rodriguez from Texas, grinned. "Think they'll believe us back home? That we stopped German tanks with a machine gun? They'll believe it if we keep doing it," Morrison replied. "The brass is taking notice. Word is they're writing new doctrine based on engagements like ours." And indeed, American tactical thinking was evolving rapidly based on frontline experience. Army. Ground Forces Command was collecting after-action reports from across the European theatre, analysing patterns of successful engagements, and disseminating lessons learned to units still training in the States. The key lesson was simple. The 50 caliber Browning M2, when properly employed, was effective against a much wider range of targets than original specifications suggested. While it could not penetrate the frontal armour of heavy German tanks, it could damage or destroy optical equipment, disable tracks and running gear, penetrate engine decks and cooling systems, suppress crew operations through concussive impacts, and at close range with armor-piercing ammunition, penetrate the side and rear armor of medium tanks and all armored vehicles with lighter protection. American crews were trained to exploit these vulnerabilities. They learned to aim for specific weak points, rather than simply firing at the center mass of enemy vehicles. They learned to sustain fire long enough to sustain fire, achieve cumulative damage effects. They learned to coordinate their fire with other weapons systems, using the .50 caliber to suppress and damage, while heavier weapons delivered killing blows. The half-tracks themselves, despite their thin armor, proved surprisingly survivable when properly employed. Their low profile and good mobility allowed them to take advantage of terrain and cover. Their crews learned to fight from defiled positions when possible, exposing only the gun mount while keeping the vulnerable hull protected. And when surprise or aggression was required, the half-track's speed allowed them to close distance rapidly, getting inside the minimum effective range of German tank guns before the enemy could respond. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German offensive had failed, and American forces were pushing back toward the pre-offensive lines. Among the equipment littering the battlefield were dozens of destroyed or abandoned German vehicles, many showing the distinctive damage pattern of .50 caliber impacts, punctured engine decks, shattered vision ports, ventilated side skirts, and in some cases, actual penetrations through relatively thin armor sections. German intelligence officers examining these wrecks began to understand what their frontline troops had been reporting. The American .50 caliber was not the limitation they had assumed. One captured German technical report from this period, recovered after the war by Allied intelligence, included the following assessment. The American .50 caliber heavy machine gun represents a significant threat to German armored vehicles, particularly at ranges below 300 meters. While the weapon cannot defeat frontal armor on most German tanks, it is highly effective against peripheral systems, optical equipment, and thin armor sections. American crews demonstrate aggressive employment tactics and are trained to sustain high volumes of fire. German forces should treat American half-tracks equipped with .50 caliber weapons as legitimate anti-armor threats, requiring appropriate caution and countermeasures. This was a remarkable reversal. At the beginning of the Ardennes campaign, German doctrine barely mentioned American half-tracks except as transport vehicles. By its end, they were categorized as serious threats, requiring specific tactical responses. But recognition came too late to change the outcome. The German army was in full retreat on all fronts. Industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombing. Fuel shortages were crippling mobile operations. Even if German tactical doctrine had fully adapted to the threat posed by American half-tracks and their .50 caliber armament, the strategic situation was irreversible. In a war where material superiority increasingly determined outcomes, the Americans had demonstrated that superiority was not just about producing more tanks or planes. It was about creating systems that worked reliably, could be produced in vast quantities, and could be employed by adequately trained crews to devastating effect. The half-track with its .50 caliber Browning was a perfect embodiment of this philosophy. The vehicle itself was simple, even crude by German engineering standards, but it was reliable, easy to produce, easy to maintain, and easy to train crews to operate. The .50 caliber gun was similarly straightforward, a design that dated to the years immediately following World War I. But it worked under all conditions, could be supplied with abundant ammunition, and when used correctly, could engage targets ranging from infantry to aircraft to armored vehicles. By February 1945, American half-tracks were operating deep inside Germany itself. They served as reconnaissance vehicles, screening advancing armor columns. They served as mobile fire support, suppressing enemy positions with sustained heavy machine gun fire. They served as convoy, escorts, their .50 calibers deterring German attempts at interdiction. And increasingly, they served as impromptu tank destroyers, using their heavy machine guns to engage German armor in exactly the ways doctrine said they should not. Dietrich survived the war. He was captured by American forces near the Elbe River in April 1945 and spent several months in a prisoner of war camp before being released. Years later, in the 1960s, he wrote a memoir of his military service that included a chapter on the Ardennes campaign. In that chapter, he described the crossroads engagement and reflected on its significance. "We had been taught to believe that German equipment was superior," he wrote. "Our tanks had thicker armour, our optics were better, our crews were more thoroughly trained, and in many respects, this was true. But the Americans understood something we did not. In industrial warfare, adequate equipment produced in overwhelming quantities defeats superior equipment produced in limited numbers. Their half-tracks were vulnerable, yes, but they had thousands of them. Their 50 caliber guns could not defeat our best armour in frontal engagements, but they didn't need to. They simply needed to cause enough damage, often enough, in enough places, that our ability to resist was ground down to nothing. This was the essential lesson of the half-track and the 50 caliber Browning. Not that American engineering was superior, though in many ways it was. Not that American tactics were more sophisticated, though they were certainly more flexible. The lesson was that war at the industrial scale rewards reliability, adaptability, and abundance over perfection. The Germans had built beautiful machines, elegant solutions to complex problems. The Americans had built good enough machines in such vast quantities that the distinction between elegant and crude ceased to matter. When one side can lose 10 vehicles and replace them overnight, and the other, the side loses 2 vehicles and cannot replace them at all, the side with abundance will prevail regardless of qualitative differences. The 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun remained in American service long after World War II ended. It fought in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Soldiers in the 21st century used weapons that were fundamentally identical to the ones that had surprised German tankers in the Ardennes forests in December 1944. The basic design proved so sound, so reliable, and so effective that no replacement was ever necessary. The half-track, by contrast, was phased out of service relatively quickly after World War II. Fully tracked armoured personnel carriers like the M113 offered better protection and mobility. But during its service life, the half-track performed roles far beyond its original design parameters, largely because of the devastating firepower provided by its 50 caliber armament. Today, military ATA historians studying the Battle of the Bulge often focus on the larger engagements: Bastogne, the defence of Street Vith, the Malmedy massacre. These were significant events that shaped the campaign's outcome. But scattered through the historical record are dozens of smaller engagements, brief firefights at nameless crossroads and forgotten villages, where American half-tracks and their 50 caliber guns fought German armour and won. These small battles did not change the strategic situation. Germany was going to lose the war regardless of what happened at any particular crossroads. But for the men who fought there, for the German soldiers who learned that their assumptions about American equipment were dangerously wrong, and for the American crews who discovered that their thin-skinned vehicles could stand and fight against tanks when necessary. These engagements were transformative. Weber, the German captain who had planned the failed ambush, also survived the war. In 1953, he was interviewed by American military historians researching the Ardennes campaign. Asked about the effectiveness of American equipment and tactics, he gave a response that captured the essence of what Germany had faced. "Your half-tracks were weakly armoured," he said through a translator. "Any of our weapons could penetrate them. But they were everywhere, always present, always firing those massive machine guns. We could not move during the day without encountering them. We could not concentrate forces without being engaged by them. Individually, they were vulnerable. Collectively, they were overwhelming. This is what defeated us. Not your best equipment, but your adequate equipment deployed in such numbers that resistance became futile." This was not an admission of American technological superiority. It was recognition of a deeper truth about modern war. The nation that can arm every vehicle with a heavy machine gun, supply every crew with abundant ammunition, and train every soldier to use these weapons effectively will possess an advantage that cannot be overcome through tactical brilliance or engineering excellence alone. The Germans had laughed at the cardboard armour of American half-tracks. They had dismissed the 50 caliber as just a large machine gun. By the time they understood their mistake, the war was already lost. The lesson was expensive, written in destroyed vehicles and failed offensives. But it was definitive. In war, as in so many human endeavors, perception and reality often diverge. The Germans perceived American half-tracks as vulnerable transports, poorly protected and unsuited for combat. The reality was that these vehicles, armed with 50 caliber machine guns and crewed by adequately trained soldiers following effective doctrine, were formidable weapons platforms capable of engaging and defeating targets well beyond their supposed capabilities. The 50 caliber Browning did not penetrate thick frontal armor. It did not need to. It found the weak points, the gaps in protection, the vulnerable systems that every vehicle possesses. It did this not through technological sophistication, but through sustained, accurate fire delivered by crews who understood their weapons' capabilities and limitations. American doctrine in World War II was built on this principle. Identify what works, produce it in quantity, train people to use it effectively, and apply it consistently. The half-track mounted 50 caliber was a perfect expression of this philosophy. Not elegant, not sophisticated, not the best possible solution. Just good enough, available everywhere, and used relentlessly. For the Germans, accustomed to fighting with carefully husbanded resources and relying on qualitative superiority to offset quantitative disadvantages, this American approach was both alien and terrifying. They could not match it. They could not counter it. They could only endure it until their capacity for resistance was exhausted. The crossroads engagement where Dietrich and Vogel watched their Panzers neutralized by half-track mounted machine guns was not unique. Similar scenes played out across France, Belgium, and Germany as the war ground toward its conclusion. Each engagement reinforced the same lessons. Each defeat drove home the same truth. In industrial warfare, the side that can sustain greater material expenditure will prevail. The Germans had brought a craftsman's approach to a mass production war. They had optimized for efficiency when the situation demanded overwhelming force. They had conserved resources when their opponents could afford to expend them freely. The result was inevitable. 70 years after the Ardennes campaign, military planners still study the lessons of that winter. The technologies have changed. The weapons are more sophisticated. But the fundamental principles remain constant. Reliability matters more than perfection. Abundance provides flexibility that quality alone cannot match. And underestimating enemy capabilities based on superficial assessments is a mistake that gets soldiers killed. The American half-track, with its thin armor and its massive 50 caliber machine gun, taught these lessons with brutal efficiency. The Germans learned them, eventually. But by then, the war was over, and the cost of education had been catastrophically high. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.